So this video keynote is called The Struggle for Self-Respect. It's an ethical approach to this boy's life, or a pedagogical approach that focuses on character and leadership in the book. The goal here is to use the text to that end. The goal is not to have any sort of holistic understanding of the whole text. There's a bunch of different things about the book that are fascinating and could be the subject of their own inquiry, and we're not even going to touch on those because, again, we're going to use the text on the boy's behalf. So because the boys can't really understand ethics in a sophisticated way if they don't have a sophisticated ethical vocabulary or conceptual background, which they don't, we need to introduce that to them. It's a big part of English 10. So here's a bunch of concepts and distinctions that will be at play in this little presentation, and we'll define these as we go, so we're not going to go through them all here. But again, the goal is to introduce these to them so that they can make these distinctions themselves, because there is no discipline whose mission is to teach them anything about ethical distinctions. And again, we're taking that on in the English department as part of our mission. So the first set of concepts we would like to introduce, it's called self-determination theory, and I sent a PDF of a major paper by the people developing this theory. I sent that out a couple weeks ago. You might want to have a look at it. It has a lot of scientific backing, and put briefly, it's the idea that there are three major areas. Again, this is, of course, once food, clothing, and shelter and all that are taken care of, but that really lead to thriving in life, and they are competence, relatedness, and autonomy. And competence is the ability to do the stuff that you need to do, and ideally you do that well, and that there's a kind of well-being that comes from that, and if that's missing, it's a huge gap in your life. Relatedness, that you feel at home in your environment, that you have friends, that you have people you trust and who trust you, and that you have a place in a greater whole. And obviously the more of that, the better. And autonomy, which is the idea that you have chosen much of what you do in your life, and it wasn't just foisted on you, and that you're doing things that are appropriate to you particularly. And again, there's a lot of scientific evidence that these do lead to thriving, and their absence leads to the lack of thriving. And so just to keep these in mind as you approach the book, here are some quotations from various parts of the book, that try to get at that these issues are in the book. This desire for autonomy, this desire for relatedness, this desire for competence. And if you start thinking about the book in these terms, you see that, oh my gosh, these people in the book are incompetent, that Jack is incompetent and he desperately wants to be competent. And not being competent leads to so many problems in his life, and Dwight's life, and his mom's life, that the relatedness is really broken down. You know, his relationship to Dwight is a disaster. He has really bad friends for most of the book, and his mother's relationships are terrible. His relationship to his family in general is very, very weak and non-existent. And autonomy. You know, there's some things he wants to do. He wants, to hunt and things, and he can't get that money to get that gun, and he wants to be on the swimming team, and again, he's just doing all these sort of random things that he wish he wasn't doing. So here they are. And so moving on to a distinction that the boys identify with immediately and find very powerful, and so I think is worth the time, is the French distinction between amour propre and amour de soi. My apologies on the pronunciation. Don't speak the language. Rousseau was the philosopher who probably made the most of these. And so amour propre is a love of self. They both mean love of self, but in totally different ways. So amour propre is the dangerous one. And it's the love of self that comes from trying to imagine how others are viewing you. And when you imagine them viewing you positively, you feel really good about yourself and love yourself, and thus move yourself to act in ways that get that positive reaction from other people. Amour de soi is what we might argue the more healthy one, and that doesn't involve going through anybody else's eyes at all, really. It involves sort of the love of self that comes from actual achieved ability to do stuff, and achieved goals and achieved positive things. And so if you think about it, these concepts are linked very closely with the self-determination concepts, because if you fail to be able to pull off amour de soi, like let's say you're not competent, so you can't actually build that kind of self-love, but you still want to love yourself, well, you could see how it's going to be so tempting to put on an act to try to trick people into thinking that you have value. And I think it's tough to argue that that's what happens in the novel. So he fails at amour de soi, and he turns to being dominated by amour propre. And so, again, there's so many instances of this, it's hard to know where to start and end. But, here are some quotations, and, I recognize no obstacle to miraculous change but the incredulity of others. Again, his change that he wants to undergo in this book is a change in the opinion through other people's eyes. And again, all the stuff with Alice and that little episode of wanting to impress her through his letters and just building this complete fiction. And then again, just the basketball game where, he plays up his injury in order to, he's just completely focused on the sympathy and positive thoughts that the fans have of him. That's pretty alien to him and his life. And then, all the stuff about wanting to go to boarding school and thinking about those guys and how so much of boarding school prep life is such a show and everybody's trying to impress each other, and he finds himself really right in the swim of it there. Again, I think a very, very interesting contrast is his discussion of the Scouts, which is mixed, because on the one hand, he's sort of like, I loved the weird performance of being in the Scouts and earning the merit badges and being able to wear those badges. So there's still a decent amount of amour propre in his appreciation of being in the Scouts. But there's more, I think, because he really does like the idea of mastery that the Scouts provides, right? You only get a badge when you've earned the badge, and to earn the badge, you need some competence. And again, that's what's missing, and it refers back to the self-determination theory idea. And so, his mixed reaction to the Scouts, I think, is highlighted when he quotes, one of the Scouts founders in that handbook, who is talking about, how jokers, ultimately fail. He says, no man given over to dissipation can stand the gaff. He quickly tires. He's the type who usually lacks courage at the crucial moment. He cannot take punishment and come back smiling. And in some sense, we can laugh at that, right? Of what an old codger who would say that. But, I think Jack or Toby, or however you look at it, he realizes that's true, right? And it's not an accident that is included in the book. And then, ultimately this sort of throwaway line, where he's talking about what he actually did learn in the Scouts. He said, the details began to fade as soon as I got through the badges, but I had learned a rough kind of competence and ease in the woods. It was a gift of priceless worth, but I did not guess its value then. And so there's two ways to take that. One could be, it saved him in Vietnam or something, and we'll never know that. But the other is like, wow, the Scouts actually taught me something. It actually taught me competence and the idea that I know what competence is and that you can build it and get some recognition for it. Is that what he means? It's certainly possible that that's what he means, because obviously to become Tobias Wolff, the famous author, he's going to have to turn things around quite a bit. And then finally, switching gears, I think that horrific Christmas scene where Dwight forces everybody to watch Lawrence Welk, and just the vision of Dwight playing the air sax, and because he doesn't have the competence to play the sax, so he sort of wants people to think that he can play, and that he's convinced himself in his own fantasy that the sound of real saxophone players is the sound coming out of his sax when it's not, right? But he just wants to look like he's playing the sax, and he wants people to see him apparently play the sax, and that he's so far gone in amour propre that he actually does this in front of other people. And so air sax, air life, the idea that most of your life could be spent trying to impress people without actually knowing how to do anything, that's worthwhile. What a tragedy that is. And I think, Jack realizes that his life is at risk of being such a tragedy. So another distinction that, again, is related to the others, and some of us have introduced this in our classes before, and some of the boys are already familiar with this, but the distinction between hedonia and eudaimonia. So, hedonia is relatively passive happiness as pleasant feeling, and eudaimonia is, literally it means good. Daimon means spirit, so it's good spirit. It's very different. It's as portrayed by the Greeks. It only builds over time, and you can't just have it 1 minute and it's gone the next. It builds over time. It's accumulated, and it comes from living virtuously and successfully throughout your life. And actually, some of the definitions of it actually call it, activity. It's so closely related with the internal goods of activities that that it's really indistinguishable. So again, to put it in context, you've got Jack or Toby, who's kind of aware of this distinction, right? But who can't really get any traction with eudaimonia. He hardly knows anybody in his life who has it. And again, the next best thing is the great feeling of amour propre. And so he's constantly taking the good feeling over the hard work that would be necessary to build actual satisfaction. And so, some of our boys are right there in the heart of that problem too. So some more concepts to introduce, just the difference between a vicious circle and a virtuous circle. And a vicious circle as something that gets a momentum that keeps the momentum going negatively, versus something that has a positive momentum that keeps the positive momentum going. And in this case, if you lack competence, relatedness, and autonomy, it makes it so hard to get them. And if you already have them, it makes it so much easier to get them. And so to try to get the boys feeling empathetic and compassionate for Jack, like to really show what it's like for somebody who doesn't have this great start in competence, relatedness, and autonomy, scratch and claw, and all the mistakes that become almost inevitable when you don't have those. And again, to try to get the boys to feel like, wow, I'm incredibly blessed that I have these and that I have the beginnings of these, and to, try to look around and go, wow, I have some classmates and there's some kids at school who don't have these as much as I do, and I could actually help them to develop them. That would be a wonderful outcome. And I didn't know there's so many quotations where Jack sort of admits to this huge gap between others and himself. And it's like, wow, I can never fill that gap. I can never catch those guys. I thought the Mouseketeers, one was interesting, where you had these, he and his friends are watching, and usually they make fun of this kind of stuff. But the Mouseketeer people are so incredibly competent, related, and autonomous that they're mesmerizing to the guys, and Jack and his quote unquote friends, and the Mouseketeers have so much momentum in competence, relatedness, and autonomy that it just sort of grows naturally as they go about their day, and Jack and his friends don't. And again, they just, they get, circle into crime and delinquency, and to try to get the boys to see that these trends are real, and to not just judge people so brutally that they're lazy or they should have just, everybody has an equal opportunity just to act. It's kind of true, but it's really, really also kind of not true. So I think we've come far enough that we can, talk about what I take to be the logic of the story as relates to, character education. And, here we go. It's that deficits in characters of real competence, relatedness, and autonomy. Those deficits lead to the creation of fantasies about competence, relatedness, and autonomy. If you don't have them, you are very prone to fake them, because you want to have value, and you want to have self-respect. And you can either earn that self-respect by doing good things, and if that is somehow blocked to you, you can appear to deserve respect from others and feel good about yourself that way. So that then leads to a shift in goal away from actually having real competence, relatedness, and autonomy to merely appearing to have them. And that shift is a disastrous shift in somebody's life, and it happens all the time. You see it everywhere, and it's brutal. I would argue then that, character, the ability to actually get stuff done in the world, gets displaced by personality, which is we're defining as the aspect of self that is performance based, that it's trying to win other people's approval as the chief leader of the self. And that causes people to be performers rather than doers. And I would argue it happens to a lot of characters in this book, Jack and Dwight in particular. And, there's lots of quotations here that I think show that. And I'll just lay them out. I'm not going to talk about them all. It would take too long to read them all and talk about them all. But there's just one that I would like to highlight, and that's what 2/3 of the way through the book or so, where Jack has had that car accident, and he's walking on the road, and he says, my footsteps were loud on the roadway. I heard them as if they came from somebody else. The movement of my legs began to feel foreign to me, and then the rest of my body foreign and unconvincing, as if I were only pretending to be someone. I watched this body clomp along. I was outside it, watching it without belief. Its imitation of purpose seemed absurd and frightening. I did not know what it was or what was watching it so anxiously from so far away. And so I take that to be, the best evidence, the best passage in the book where Jack actually gets what's going on, right? He's like, oh my God, I'm a pretender. And my whole life is a sham. I'm not after meaning. I'm after the facsimile of meaning. I'm not after purpose. I'm after somebody thinking I have purpose. And that's terrifying to Jack. But again, he's not in a position to easily reverse that. And the tough work that would be required to pull himself up by his own bootstraps, he doesn't have that in him, at least at that age. And, he goes on with his shenanigans. Continuing with that reading, we get the late revelation from Jack in a variety of ways that, he sort of views his making up these fictional identities with other people as a kind of strategy to keep him afloat until the time comes when he can actually turn this thing around in a real way. And so it's a fascinating idea, and let's think it through. He says in this quotation, I could be different. I could introduce myself as a scholar athlete, a boy of dignity and consequence, and without any reason to doubt me, people would believe I was that boy and thus allow me to be that boy. I recognize no obstacle to miraculous change but the incredulity of others. And so there's the problem, right? It's double whammy problem. He doesn't have the goods to actually be successful, be a good guy, to thrive. He doesn't have them at this time. And he's a loser. By his own standards, he's a loser. So he invents this other self, right? He constantly is portraying himself as somebody other than he is, as somebody with great competence, in order to be allowed to perhaps be that self, right? So part of his problem is that the perception of him by others and of him is so low that he will live down to that perception. So by raising the perception, he hopes that will spur him to actually be the person he is portraying. And he seems to actually take that seriously. And who knows, maybe that actually saves him. In this other quotation, I was his perfect witness, and he was mine. We listened without objection to stories of usurped nobility that grew in preposterous intricacy with every telling. But we did not feel as if anything we said was a lie. We both believed that the real lie was told by our present unworthy circumstances, right? So there's this sense that, hey, I have value, but my circumstances won't allow me to have that value. And so I'm going to need to lie to change the circumstances so that I can actually believe in myself enough, perhaps, to take action. And then again, we get this great, quotation at the end about, look, I wouldn't have made up being on the football team because I have no interest in football, right? But hey, I would have loved to be on the school swim team. We just didn't have one. And so it's like he's got this idea of who he could actually be if the world would just let him be that self, if circumstances were different. And he then sort of insists on the value of that self. It's an interesting kind of telos that he has for himself, right? It's like, hey, here's my telos. This is what I would have been had I been at all fortunate in my circumstances. And I have a right to play up to that truth, even though it's a lie, right? In actuality, but in deep in my soul, this is what I could be, and this is how I see myself. So it's not a full lie. He's not doing anything he could to convince people that he's just of some complete fantasy. There is this interesting aspect of the reality of what ought to have been his real possibility that I find utterly fascinating, and that gets at the heart of the paper topic for summer reading. So let's talk about another distinction. Obviously, it relates to all the previous distinctions too, and that's between, success, put in scare quotes, and thriving. And, let's define success as winning a relative competition against other people for approval. And so, I'm a success. I have won the approval of other people. And usually that means that they rank me relatively highly compared to other people, right? And so it's a massive issue for Jack because his problems with real thriving, as we've argued, the main reading of the book here, is that, again, that he can't thrive when he's young, and he does the next best thing. He tries to fake his way into success. And unlike thriving, which can't be faked, success can be faked and maybe even is closely related to an act. And because it involves having people view you as a success as opposed to actually thriving. And so, our boys, they've got this picture, many of them, right? If you have a certain address, you work for a certain firm, you work at the Crescent, you're in, private wealth management, or you work for JP Morgan and investment banking down at the Crescent, and, you live on Beverly Drive and blah, 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 blah. You know the deal, all the brands, right? Well, those are things people think of as successful. So if you have those things, right, you're a success. And that's a massive issue for, I would say, 100% of our boys. And some of our boys are fortunate enough to also have this idea of thriving, or at least a nascent sense of thriving, whether they use that word or not. And that's different. That's where you actually are doing these good acts that are self-rewarding and self-enacting, right? Literally enacting of character, of the telos, of narrative, of personality too, but within its place. And are also building competence, relatedness, and autonomy in real ways. And so it's a really good distinction to introduce here because it just permeates the book. And so Jack at various points says like how averse to work that he is, right? And he because he goes so far over into performance land, work becomes this thing that he dreads. And it's all about fooling people into thinking that you are whatever way. And it's about choosing and picking and performing. And it's not about doing. And so, and again, just one of the most interesting things about the book, I think, is when Jack just so brutally judges the Welches. It's like these people are losers, and I can't apologize to losers. That it shows the kind of fierce self-judgment that Jack has sort of digested from the culture around him. And again, it's one of the reasons he's got to lie to himself, right? Because if he actually doesn't lie to himself, then he's gonna that negative judgment will strike home, and who knows what he would do, become an alcoholic or commit suicide or whatever would follow from something that horrible. And it's not sure. I'm not sure which of these to introduce in what order, but this could have gone first, I suppose. But all the different aspects of self that are at play in this book are you could go to town with those. So what a great time to introduce these. Again, the boys have no idea what a self is and no way to talk about it. So we're going to try to change that by giving them some entree into it that has some interesting traction with things about their life. So again, this is in the handbook. If you want to look at that page, there's even more aspects of the self that are there. And what a mess. Some of these things are partner nicely, and some of them are fight all the time. And these are all over the place for Jack. So, character is the capacity to give effective care. It's your virtues minus your vices. That's how we're defining it, right? Your personality is the way we're defining it is your ability to portray yourself, right? To dramatically enact yourself. And again, those two can go well together, or they could fight the whole time. The telos is yourself as the idea of yourself at your best that is operative in your life, versus, so there's sort of an operative telos, like what do you think your telos is, which is operative in your life. And then there's your actual telos, which you might be ignorant of, right? Which is what you could be if you actually everything went well for you. And that's a fascinating one for Jack, right? Because it's like he's holding out for his real telos, even though his actual one in the moment is really weak. And anyway, we've discussed that. Intellect, your ability to distinguish images of the world from actualities in the world. That's a very interesting one for Jack. Brand, how do people view you? Do people trust you as a dependable commodity? Do they look on you with favor? And then, narrative as the best true story you can tell about yourself. And what's a true story about yourself? That issue is really problematized, in this book. So there's so many passages that relate to aspects of self. They're all over the book. Here are some. My apologies for having the digital version. It would have taken me forever to type this in, and so the pages aren't going to be the same. I think these are roughly chronological, as all of them are in the book, as all of them are in this presentation, I think, in each segment. But all sorts of stuff about telos and having one and not having one, and performing versus doing, and wanting a good life but not knowing how to get it, and the whole amor-propre move, and the different kinds of satisfaction that come from each of these aspects of selfhood. There they all are. I'll let you look at them, and you might have better ones. The last one in the list, I think, is one of the most interesting to me, right? Where he's looking at himself in a mirror when he's trying on clothes to go to boarding school, and here are these two people that are confronting each other, and sort of, the fantasy and the reality, and he's hoping that the fantasy is convincing enough to reality, that reality is convincing enough to the fantasy to give it some hope that this might actually work, because he realizes he is incredibly character poor. And if the fantasy knew what a bogus character that he had to work with, he's worried that the fantasy wouldn't even perform the fantasy because it's such a losing cause. But then there's this very last one. There was a dash of swagger in his pose, something of the stage cavalier. And again, this is the image in the mirror. But his smile was friendly and hopeful. So you have this sense, right, that there is this empathetic person there who, if he had enough strength, would want to be compassionate, but there's a benevolent being deep down, even though it's not really allowed to show itself very often. And so you've got this great combo, if it could work, right, of a kind of very, very good person who also has a kind of swag of personality. And, those are generally fun people to be around and make good friends and all that if you've got both of those. So there's sort of this little sign of hope. Obviously, the schooling doesn't go very well. And so, again, we've talked so much about Jack, but we really want to just mention Dwight here briefly as just what an incredible portrayal of somebody who has an ineffective character and who goes through the same process then of completely fantasizing about his own capacities because he doesn't have any capacities for whatever reason. And he just becomes this buffoon, and his personality just cannot carry that kind of load. So what a great portrayal of somebody whose character failures lead to life failure, just so obviously and directly, both for him and for, you know, Jack and Jack's mom. And, you know, it really is a sort of undeniable. It's so well done. You know, and just the rage, right, of wanting so badly to be competent and faking it so much, but just the act can't work. And, you know, he even, you know, he fakes being virtuous, and he pours everybody drinks, and you know, he goes and gets people in order to try to woo Jack's mom. But once he's got her, then he resorts to this violent, you know, person who is just taking out his frustrations at his own incompetence on everybody who's doomed to be around him. Again, just don't want to let that pass as, you know, do you see that, you know, this is what it is here. Finally, you know, the beginnings of a kind of scorecard for Jack on the virtues of thriving. You know, these are the virtues that we've talked about in a variety of people involved in the program have highlighted as some of the most important ones. Obviously, there's dozens more important ones, but these are ones we want everybody to focus on, whatever other ones you want to focus on. And so, you know, try to put the trouble spots in red and the good ones in blue, and the mediocre ones in white. They're all so tricky, because in some ways Jack wants to be benevolent, right? But thieves aren't benevolent, and hooligans cannot really be counted as benevolent. And he does seem to have an incredible empathy, right? He feels with the Welches, he feels with his mom, he even feels with Dwight, he feels with everybody. But the problem is he doesn't have compassion. And that's a tricky combination, to have empathy and compassion, because you can be a real torture artist if you have empathy and no compassion. Because remember, compassion is owning the life outcomes of the other person that you're feeling with. And Jack doesn't really do that. I'd say the Welches are the best example, right? He's too concerned about himself, his own narrow selfhood, to be much of a carer. You know, he's completely confused about image and reality, so he's not wise. You know, he's stingy because he doesn't have enough to give away. You know, he's always bragging beyond his ability, so he's not modest. He's got a hyperactive imagination. I think it's debatable whether it helps him or hurts him in the long run, but certainly active. Courage, you know, sort of his character courage is fairly low. His personality courage is quite high. Hard to know how to discuss that one. He does come back again and again and again, but he can't really stick with anything. So resoluteness, he's not detail-oriented, he's not constant, he's just all over the place, scratching and clawing to stay in the game, right? And the habitual attitude of entrepreneurial service, definitely not. He's just not even trying to help other people. He's busy trying to save the day for himself. And also the skills that we'd like you to talk about, you know, not necessarily all of them all the time, but, you know, these are the skills that the program wants us to highlight and wants the boys to be aware of and to self-evaluate on. And so, you know, leadership in the program's view is a combination of engagement, service, and coordinating the activities of others toward shared ends, which involves a lot of problem solving. So there's sort of these micro concepts in the bigger concepts. And this is, again, really, really challenging to do, because when it comes to community building, Jack is a catastrophe. It's not even really on his radar, as we've said, because he's so concerned with saving his own soul through this debacle. So he's terrible at the practicalities of helping other people, and he's not a good problem solver for anyone else, right? He's sort of but he is a good listener, and he can define things well, and he's a hyper imagination and very, inventive of solutions. They're just never applied to anyone else's good, really. And he's such a liar about things. He's not a very good evaluator. But again, so when it comes, he just has no practice, right? One of our main lessons is you throw yourself into engagement, service, and coordination and problem solving. You're going to eventually probably get as really good at these things. Like anything else, if you practice a lot, you get much better at it. And Jack just doesn't practice caring for other people in any serious way, and thus by the end of the book, he's still terrible at it. And also, ask you to talk through the three aspects of character education, leadership education, in the head, the heart, the hands, the understanding, responsive feeling, and the skills of caring. And I would say Jack/Toby, though obviously there's potential there as you look at what happens later. But when this book ends, Jack has flipped image and reality. And to him, image is the reality, and reality is some image that's not possible for him. He has a very damaged heart. He thinks it's damaged by his long experience with Dwight. But again, I would say the Welches is probably the best example, where he's he does this terrible thing to these people and he can't apologize. And he's a terrible caregiver. He's an abusive boyfriend, playboy, and he's a trivial friend, and he just has no skill at it, and he's too busy trying to save his own skin. And just to keep going, we're trying to teach the boys strategies to think about their lives, and reinforce them through repetition, because that's the way they learn. And they just don't have any of these strategies, most of them, now. So we're trying to teach them these strategies. And here's another one, right? So to try to think about Jack's web of social roles, these different aspects of selfhood. How does he do in web of social roles? Really badly, right? How about his telos? His telos is, by our standards, incredibly superficial, right? It's an amor-propre-laden telos, and it gets him in so much trouble. He's an incredibly ineffective caregiver. His narrative is largely a pack of lies. He can't tell the truth to anyone. He does have a relatively strong personality. Again, we put it in white rather than blue, though, because it's so overstrong, his performance of himself, that it gets him in trouble. But it's certainly strong, so it's hard to know how to exactly evaluate that. And to finish, just two lists of questions. There's obviously many, many more to maybe get your imagination going, that you could ask the boys. Where are the boys on all these issues? Where are they personally on all these issues? And how about their classmates? And so I'm not going to go through these all. I would just be reading them. I hope by the end of this presentation, they're now kind of self-explanatory, why they're interesting or important. And there they are, use of them what you will, and use of this whole, approach what you will or not. It's obviously completely up to you. If you want to give me some feedback on whether this is helpful or not, I'd love to hear it, how it could be made better, or if it's just not worth the time. So anyway, good luck on this, and I appreciate all of your participation.